We're going to finish up part 3 by talking briefly about blood vessels and then giving a little bit of discussion around the respiratory system and the lungs, which are associated with the cardiovascular system. So the blood vessels are made up of two types of blood vessels: the arteries, shown here, and the veins, shown here. And probably the biggest difference between the artery and the vein is the thickness and composition of the walls of the arteries versus the walls of the veins. The veins are very thin-walled, have very little in the way of musculature. There is musculature there, but it's much less than the artery. The artery has a thick muscle coat and several more layers. And this would make sense since the arteries carry blood that is of a much higher pressure than the veins. The vein pressure somewhere between 10 and 15 millimeters. Artery pressure is systemic blood pressure 120/80. Then again, between the arteries and the veins are the capillaries, which are very thin-walled. They're actually, at their thinnest, one cell thick, which allows for the diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide across the walls. The smaller arteries are called arterioles that lead to the capillaries, and the smaller veins are called venules, which lead ultimately to the artery and the vein, respectively. Disease of the artery is called atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis is a narrowing and hardening of the arteries that's due to fat deposits, generally caused by abnormal cholesterol metabolism. This forms a deposit which is called plaque, which also has, in addition to the fat, calcium deposit. The blood circulation, the systemic circulation, is shown here, and many of the arteries and veins are named for the same way that the various bones or muscles are named. For example, you have the ulnar bone is in your forearm, well, so is the ulnar artery and the ulnar vein. There's also a radial artery and a radial vein. The humerus, it's not a humerus artery, it's called the brachial artery and the brachial vein, and so forth. And so this is the systemic circulation. We talked about the coronary arteries. The third circulation that we haven't talked about yet is, by third, I mean the first circulation is the systemic circulation. The second circulation is the pulmonary circulation in the lungs. The third circulation is what's known as the portal circulation. And this is the circulation from the intestine into the liver. Blood pressure is the force that's exerted on the artery walls, not the veins, the artery walls, by the function of the heart. The systolic pressure is when the ventricle contracts. That higher pressure is the pressure induced by the ventricular contraction. And diastole is the lower pressure that occurs during the relaxation of the ventricle. Hypertension is the doctor word for high blood pressure when the pressure is above where it should be. Pressure is measured in millimeters of mercury. If you've had basic science before, you know that this is one way of measuring both liquid and atmospheric pressure. As I said, high blood pressure is the same idea as hypertension. The pulse, each pulse represents a contraction of the ventricle. And when you feel the pulse beat, it's when the ventricle contracts. And the peak of that pulse beat is the systemic pressure. You can feel this in the carotid artery, which is in the neck. You can feel it in the radial artery, which is the artery that people feel in the wrist. You can feel it in the temporal artery or in the temple. Now, we've talked about the liver before, but I wanted to show you this to show you where the portal circulation is. The portal circulation starts down here in the intestine and goes up into the liver from below. And you can see that the liver is divided into lobes. There's the left lobe and the right lobe of the liver. Each subunit of the liver is called a lobule, and the cells within the liver are called hepatic cells, and they have an hepatic artery as well as a portal vessel that's associated with them. The glucose storage occurs in a form known as glycogen, and this is stored in the liver as well as in the muscle. A viral infection of the liver is called viral hepatitis. Again, the word itis means inflammation of the liver that's caused by a virus. And cirrhosis is the scarring of the liver that occurs after injuries. The leading cause of death in the United States is cardiovascular disease. Obesity is frequently associated with increased cholesterol, which leads to cardiovascular disease. Smoking is probably the worst risk factor for various forms of cardiovascular disease, including stroke, heart attack, and peripheral vascular disease. The nicotine in smoking is what's thought to be the most prominent toxin that causes problems in the blood vessels. Now we're going to move very quickly over to the respiratory system. The respiratory system takes in air from the outside, bringing with it oxygen, and then when you breathe out, you remove carbon dioxide from the body. So it's a form of excretory system as well as the intake of oxygen. The lungs are the principal organ that does the work of taking in the oxygen and removing carbon dioxide. External respiration is a term that means the movement of air from the outside of the body into the lungs till it reaches the alveolus. Internal respiration is the transfer of oxygen to the red blood cells and then to the tissues, and then from the tissues back to the red blood cells. And then cellular respiration is the process of releasing energy from food. So there's three types of respiration: external, internal, and cellular. Please make sure you understand the difference between those three. Breathing starts at the nose, and the nasal cavity actually has an important function. There are actually two functions. One is it warms the air as it comes into your body. And so the air is brought into your nose. There are actually something called turbinate bones that cause a stirring of the air, a turbulent stirring of the air, which allows the warmth of the nasal cavity to warm the air up. And then it also, there's mucus in there which captures small particulate matter, which can ultimately be removed at another time. So the places where all this mixing occurs is called the nasal meatus. Then the air moves down into the lung, first moving to the tube called the trachea. The trachea is the single solid tube that's in the middle of your throat. And the opening of the trachea is called the glottis. Remember the epiglottis, when we were talking about the GI system, the epiglottis was important to keep air from, or to keep food from going down into the trachea. So the glottis is where the air enters into the trachea. And then it passes through the larynx. The larynx is where the voice box is, where we speak. And there are two types of folds or tissue that's in the larynx. One's called the vocal cord, and the other's called the false cord. The vocal cord, or the vocal folds, are flaps of tissue that produce sound. Once it gets down to the trachea, then the trachea divides in two, into the left and the right bronchi, and then branching begins to occur. From the single bronchus on the left and on the right, it begins to branch over and over and over again. The next branch is called the secondary branch, and then you reach a smaller division that contains no cartilage in the wall. That's called the bronchiole. And then ultimately you reach the air sacs. And the air sacs is where gas exchange occurs. The air sacs are called alveoli. And air moves into the blood and out of the blood by means of diffusion across a concentration gradient. So here's the air starts out here, moves into the nose, and this area, these are where the turbinate bones are, that warms the air up and removes some particulate matter. It then moves down past through the pharynx and past the epiglottis and into the larynx area. And this is where the vocal cords are. Down the trachea until it reaches the carina being the division between left and right. And it goes down the left and right side. These are called bronchi. Then you have secondary divisions or secondary bronchi. and then bronchioles, which are smaller, and then ultimately you can't see alveoli on a large picture like this. And so over here shows the alveoli, the bronchioles that lead to the alveoli, the associated arteries and veins that are also associated with the alveoli. And then this shows the diffusion of oxygen from the alveolus into the blood and carbon dioxide from the blood into the alveolus. Just one more thing I'll point out here is the diaphragm, which is this muscle right here, and this is responsible for causing us to take air in and breathe air out. Bronchitis, again, inflammation, itis, is inflammation of the bronchus, and it is usually associated with a significant cough as the principal symptom, along with some mucus production. Pneumonia is an infection of the lung itself, not the same as bronchitis. And then asthma is reversible, key word here is reversible airways obstruction. Generally it's transient, which means it doesn't last. It's reversible, which means there are periods in which the person is normal, and then it causes airway obstruction and difficulty getting breath in. Now, when we talk about how breathing occurs, there are several organs that are important, and the first is the rib cage. On the outside of the rib cage is something called the pleura. The pleura is like the pericardium in the heart. The pleura is a covering that covers the heart. There's actually a visceral pleura, which is up against the lung, and a parietal pleura, which is up against the chest wall. And these two slide on each other and allow for easy movement of the lung within the chest cavity. Again, if you get pleuritis or pleurisy, this is an inflammation of the pleural cavity. The diaphragm, as I stated before, is the primary muscle responsible for breathing. There are other muscles that help with breathing. They're called intercostal muscles, which are the muscles between the ribs. These are called secondary muscles of respiration. Also, actually, the sternocleidomastoid is a secondary muscle of respiration, but the principal muscle in most people during normal breathing is the diaphragm. So when inhalation occurs, the diaphragm moves down. This increases the size of the chest cavity. Increase in volume leads to a decrease in pressure inside the chest cavity, so that the pressure inside the chest cavity is lower than the pressure outside the chest cavity. And this causes air to move in from high pressure to low pressure. The exhalation is exactly the opposite. But the inhalation is an active process where the diaphragm has to contract. Exhalation is a relaxation, so no energy is actually used during normal exhalation. And the chest cavity gets smaller. A decrease in volume causes an increase in pressure within the chest cavity, and it pushes air out of the chest cavity and out to the outside world. This is all controlled from the brain by the medulla oblongata and the breathing center in the medulla oblongata. Vital capacity is defined as the maximum volume that a person can take in or breathe out. And this can be measured by a device known as a spirometer. The tidal volume is the amount of air that is moved during a normal breathing cycle. Vital capacity is the maximum. Tidal volume is normal. A common cold is an viral infection of the upper respiratory tract. Influenza is a viral infection of generally the upper respiratory tract, but can move down the respiratory tract and cause viral pneumonia. And tuberculosis is an infection of the lung caused by the tuberculous bacillus. Emphysema is a specific loss of alveoli. That is the definition of emphysema. It's the loss of alveoli, loss of functioning lung, and frequently is associated with actually an increased volume of the chest cavity. Cystic fibrosis is a genetically inherited disease in which the person produces abnormal mucus, which causes obstruction of the smaller bronchioles and chronic infections. And then lung cancer is a problem associated primarily with smoking, in which the bronchial cells become cancerous and lead to cancerous problems in the chest.